Now, I'm going to focus on the settlement of two areas of America, one in Virginia and one in New England. And we're going to talk about Virginia today. And the first thing we want to know, obviously, is that Virginia was founded earlier by people who came to America to make money. Okay, so what happened was that there were actually two different companies in England. One was the Virginia Company of Plymouth, and the other one was the Virginia Company of London. Okay, Virginia Company of Plymouth actually was the first, but they sailed off course and ended up landing in New England in the wintertime, and so they didn't quite make it. Right? The other one, the Virginia Company of London, consisted of 100 gentlemen. Okay, these two companies are actually called joint stock companies, and what happens is that people in England will invest in the company with the idea that these people are going to go to America and they're going to extract value that will make money for the investors. Okay, you guys get what I'm saying? So this is very much like the Spanish conquest in a way. And this was essentially what the Virginia Company of London thought when the first 100 people from England came to Jamestown, all right, or what we call the Tidewater region. So let me show you the map here. The Tidewater region is basically this area, Chesapeake Bay. And the reality of settling in the Tidewater region was you could not have chosen a less healthy spot to try to form a colony, because there were various diseases and insects and bad weather, swamps and things like that caused a lot of sickness in the English settlers, okay, when they came, all right? But the point here is that when the English came to America, they weren't looking to form a settlement and start a colony. What they wanted to do was to figure out how to make money, right? And you're going to find this you probably don't know this, but you're going to find this almost comical. And that is that these 100 gentlemen thought that what they would do would be to basically follow the lead of the Spanish. And the idea was that they would take 100 gentlemen and go to America, and they would find some great Indian empire like Tenochtitlan, and they would conquer that empire and extract all of its value like the Spanish had done, okay? And since the Spanish had been able to do it with 600, the British thought, well, we only need 100. You guys get what I'm saying? All right. So there was a big problem with their strategy. The big problem with their strategy of coming to America and finding a great Indian empire to conquer was what?
There was no Indian empire. They were all divided into multiple tribes.
There was no great Indian empire. Remember, we talked about the two kinds of settlement in America last week? We talked about two different economies. Do you remember the two different economies?
One that exploited the land and one that exploited the people.
And what did we call those? Surplus and subsistence. Remember? The surplus is the one where there's enough people to make enough for everybody and there's something left over, right? And subsistence was what? What was that economy? Everybody worked to make just enough for everybody to live, okay? And that's what kind of economy was here. Actually, all over North America, for the most part, was a subsistence economy, which meant that there was no great Indian empire. And that also turned out to be a real problem for the English, because the English that came to America, because they were gentlemen, they saw it as beneath their station to actually do any physical labor, right? Because a gentleman is supposed to serve at court or be a soldier or a lawyer or something like that. A gentleman is not supposed to be a worker on the land or to even do marketing, even to do trading. Okay, that's beneath a gentleman. You guys get what I'm saying? So here we have 100 guys they come to America, they're dying like crazy because of the diseases and things like that. And they don't have enough food, and they don't have any way to get any food because they refuse to work, right? They just see it as beneath their station. I know it's crazy, but this is the way it worked out, right? Okay, so you guys all know the story of Pocahontas, right? You guys have all heard of Pocahontas. You guys watched the Disney movie, right? And,
Yes.
and Grandma Willow and all that stuff. Actually, Grandma Willow was not real, as far as we know. Okay, and Disney was not even as good of a historian as Neil Young or Bob Dylan, right? But at any rate, the point here is that there was some truth to the idea that the local leader of the local natives actually helped the English to by giving them food and things like that, so they survived, right? And then the English thought, well, that's a great idea. We'll just let them take care of us. But the problem, of course, with with the natives taking care of the English was what? What kind of an economy did they have?
Subsistence?
Subsistence, exactly. Which meant what?
They only had enough for themselves.
Right. There wasn't anything left over. So they couldn't really take care of the Englishmen. And so the Englishmen decided then the best thing to do would be to enslave them. Right. Okay. That doesn't actually work out for them very well because the natives, they're not recognizable one from another. Right. So if you had a native slave and he ran away, you wouldn't be able to find him again because they all look the same to the natives, right? To the English. And then on top of that, the natives knew the land much better than the English did. So there was no way they could keep actually, just to say it this way, Native American slavery never worked out in North America. It didn't really work out anywhere, but it certainly didn't work out in North America. And so what ended up happening was that we have this group of Englishmen, and then you guys all know the story of John Smith and how John Smith forces them to actually work so they can make it through the winter. And then next year, more people come and the colony starts to grow. But they're really on the hook here because this is a joint stock company, which means what?
They're looking for profit, the investors.
Exactly, because they have to pay off their investors, right? Okay, well, they haven't found any profit. They didn't find any great Indian empire. So they look for some way to make money and they settle on tobacco, right? They start plantation agriculture, growing tobacco, all right? Basically, the only way you can really grow tobacco is on a plantation, right? The problem, of course, with plantation agriculture is that you need labor, right? And so what happens is they couldn't get the Indians to work for them. So they start off with indentured labor, okay? Indentured labor essentially is that you're in England and you see this advertisement saying, look, I can go to Virginia and work as a laborer for 5 years or 6 years, right? And then at the end of that time, they're going to give me land, okay? And you have to keep in mind that for Europeans at this time, land was exactly the same as money. So this was like saying, I'm going to work for 6 years and then I'm going to get a lot of money, okay? You guys are following here? I get free passage to America. I get room and board and the use of all the tools that I need. And at the end, I get some land and I get the tools that I need to work the land. So that sounds like a good deal, right? Particularly if you're being persecuted in England over your religious affiliations, right? You guys follow what I'm saying? So a lot of people.
Sorry, was it impossible to acquire land in England?
Oh yeah, all the land in Europe was already owned, right? The only way you could get land in anywhere in Europe was to inherit it or to conquer it, right? So all right, so that's a good question. Now, so here's the problem: that the indentured servitude was not slavery, but it often ended up essentially being like slavery because you were forced to work for the plantation owner until you died. And the reason why was because obviously the mortality rate was very high because of the bad climate and the bad diseases, right? And then the owners were actually less than honest, right? And so what would happen would be that you're working, say, and you get sick, and so you're not able to work for a day. That would add on a day at the end of your term. So your term would get longer, right? Or let's say you're working one day and you break a tool, right? Well, you have to pay for that tool. So they add on 30 days at the end of your term. You guys get what I'm saying? So eventually what ends up happening is that that indentured servitude ends up being like slavery, essentially, right? And the big problem that the English have, the English owners, I should say, have, is that by now, most of England is Protestant, which means that they all know how to read and write, okay? Why do Protestants need to read and write?
So they're able to read scripture from the Bible.
Exactly, right? And so what they do is they write back home and say, this is stupid, don't do it, this is a bad deal, right? And the next thing you know, there's another labor shortage here in the Tidewater region, okay? So how do they solve that? Well, then in 1619, there's a visiting ship that was carrying slaves, and they traded those slaves. Those slaves were of African descent, right? They came from the Caribbean, actually, right? But they were of African descent, and the tobacco owners settled on the idea that they could actually use them as plantation labor. And the advantage of that was that they didn't know the land, and they were very easily recognizable because they were black, right? And so there starts to be a growing black population in the Tidewater region, okay? Most of them being slaves, but not all of them. Some of them were actually free men, but they were free men like the free white men, which were also very poor, very, very much at the bottom of the socioeconomic scale, right? So there were free black men and free white men, right? And then there were slaves, okay? And there were indentured servants. So essentially there wasn't really any difference between the races. And at this point, racism really doesn't exist, okay? It does, but not in the way that we think about it, okay? And what that means then is that if you were a white indentured servant, or if you were a poor white free man, and you saw a black free man or a black slave, you would know they were different, and you would have different cultures and different, you would be recognizably different to each other, but you wouldn't consider one to be less than the other. You guys get what I'm saying? You wouldn't consider one to be inferior to the other. You follow what I'm saying here? And that's where racism comes in, okay? Let me just mention to you right now, and we'll continue talking about this as we go on. How do you identify racism? Racism is when one group of people looks at another group of people based on some external criteria and decides that those people are irredeemably inferior. You know, we talked, I think, about Aristotle and natural inferiority, right? Natural inferiority means that these people are not capable of achieving the same level of humanity as I am because of some inherent characteristic that can't be overcome, right? Okay, so for example, let me give you, it's a really bad example, but it'll make you understand. It's like a horse. You know, a horse has its uses, but you would not expect to teach a horse how to talk, right? Because they're physically incapable of talking. You understand what I'm saying? And that's the way that's the way a racist views somebody who they're racist against. You guys get what I'm saying? There is this unredeemable, uncorrectable difference between the two on the part of the person that's racist that causes that other person to be inferior. Okay, and so then what is going to be your attitude towards somebody that you're racist against? Well, you're either going to be you're going to be exploitative, meaning that you exploit that person or that person, or you will be exclusive, meaning that you either export them or get rid of them or kill them. Right? You guys get what I'm saying? All right. So that's racism, and that's different from other forms of aversion, which we'll talk about later. Okay. Okay. So here now we have this situation in the Tidewater region. And what really ends up being established in the Tidewater region is a society that very much resembles medieval Europe. Okay. And if you think about it, in some ways, it is reminiscent of the encomienda, right? But you remember the encomienda was based on medieval Europe, right? And the idea was that all of the value was in the land, that the Lord actually had control of the land and the labor, right? And that the people who lived on the land owed the Lord labor. Okay. Now that's basically the same thing here, except for in most cases, actually, in the American South, the Lord, what we call the Lord, will actually be a plantation owner, usually not a lord, right? Or not a noble. And then the worker will be a slave. So it's not exactly the same, but the economy is the same in that it's producing agricultural goods. Its value comes from the land.